Welcome back to the Warrior Servant Leader podcast. We're so happy to have you joining us today. We have a fascinating guest. We're going to get into a topic that we haven't actually discussed previously in our 60 some odd episodes, and we're going to dive into it today. Our guest, Rob Mahoney, is a leading expert in behavioral threat assessment and the founder of TVTP Solutions. He specializes in helping communities transition from reactive security to proactive prevention. Through his work, he empowers educators, law enforcement, and mental health professionals to collaborate on identifying the pathway to violence and interrupting it through evidence-based strategies. Rob, man, it's great to have you here today. I'm excited to talk about your background and your experience and what you're bringing to communities to help them make them safer. Because one of the fundamental things that you've learned and have become an expert in is that violence isn't random, and there's ways of identifying it and taking steps to prevent it. So
Yep.
tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into this arena of threat assessment and the world of violence that we're experiencing like every day in the United States and in the whole world, actually.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I started the journey actually started probably around 2005. And so I was at home watching the Katrina coverage, as you know, millions of us were, and kind of just got the itch that, you know, this emergency management thing seemed to be, you know, the dropping of a major ball and the lack of coordination that was happening and everything else. And I just had this sort of urge to delve into that more. And so I went and got a master's degree in emergency and disaster management and started working with, you know, first at county level and then sort of with states and federal, obviously with FEMA, and began to sort of do different plans and helping with different plans for different regions, whether it was the Cascadia seismic zone plan out in Alaska and the upper Pacific Northwest. I did a plan in Region 7, which is sort of like the middle of America in Missouri, on a food distributions plan. I did some nuke rad stuff for the National Capital Region. And then I started moving into doing stuff for the National Hurricane Program and doing a lot of stuff on the East Coast for prepping, you know, the East Coast and the Caribbean for hurricane disasters. And so a lot of that work was more relationship building. It was more trust building and sort of letting the experts kind of give you the data, but then developing sort of, okay, how do all of these different things mesh, right? And how do we get everybody to kind of move in the same direction? And how are we sharing information and a lot of that coordination? And so over, you know, I had been doing that for a while. And as more and more targeted violence events became more prevalent in the country and things like that, I began to see this sort of paradoxical narrative where after an attack, I would hear this was a horrible random act of violence. And yet when sort of law enforcement or mental health or the mayors or anything else and the investigations of that individual who perpetrated that attack, their character arc and their storyline showed a number of different touch points of individuals who are concerned about their behavior, sometimes, you know, being suspended or expelled from school, sometimes touch points with mental health programs or public health programs, various interactions with law enforcement. And I just couldn't really square that circle, right? Like, well, how are you saying it's a random act of violence, and yet you had all these different reports and all these different touch points with this individual and showing sort of this escalation of behavior? And so I decided that I was going to sort of take that coordination expertise that I had been doing with my emergency management background, and started really delving into more of this violence prevention arena.
Mm-hmm.
And come to find out that the long and short of it is that we often think that we have a reporting problem around these events, and that's not the case. We don't have a reporting problem. What we have is a coordination problem. And a lot of different institutions and programs within the community already have a knowledge of concerning individuals, but the systems that are put in place are rather rigid. They don't necessarily allow for a lot of cross coordination. The cross coordination that is done is usually rather flimsy, where they have sort of single points of failure where, it might be a few people in one agency coordinating with another, but one of those individuals kind of retires or gets a promotion or moves to a different, part of the system, and the whole network kind of like falls apart. And so really trying to get communities to understand that we are sort of the victims of sort of a Leighton's error, where we have kind of designed these systems in place to be hyper optimized for single issue type things within an individual, and that we create these sort of thresholds where that individual has to cross over in order for us to respond. And what I try to do is I try to kind of break that down a little bit. Some of it is just reframing how we evaluate what is concerning behavior and what we're looking for. And some of it is actually doing the work of trying to integrate this coordination into just the way the town does business, or the city does business, or the state does business, so that people within those systems can kind of drop off or come in, and it's still seamless in the way in which we conduct sort of this concept of care around individuals who desperately need attention before they even are starting to consider doing some type of act of violence.
Wow. And having come out of nearly 30 years of law enforcement, 40 plus years altogether in the criminal justice arena, I can completely understand that perspective that we silo information, and that things can be personality driven as opposed to institutionalized processes and systems that will survive a police chief leaving to go somewhere else. And one of the things that immediately came to mind as you were sharing that conundrum that we're in is I remember back in the 90s, Dr. David Kennedy from Kennedy School of Business, no relation to, at least I don't think, to the Kennedys. But he came up with, they called it the Boston Miracle, and they weren't talking about baseball. It was, he came up with a community initiative to reduce he called it group violence. We called it gang violence in Dayton, Ohio. And he brought this about in 1996. And it was exactly what you were talking about. It was that collaboration of multiple resources, community involvement, the faith community involvement, social services, law enforcement, the courts, all sorts of different groups coming together with a common message of stop the killing. And this was specifically what he called GMIs, group member involved homicides. We just call it gang violence. And it worked. I mean, from 1996 to 2000, they reduced their group member involved homicides significantly. I mean, like 50% plus. And then they developed this attitude of, well, we did what we wanted to accomplish, and then they stopped doing it. And then by 2004, they were right back to their 1996, pre-96 homicide rate. And we adopted that program, but we institutionalized it in Dayton, Ohio. And I was tasked with kind of heading it up for my last 4 years with the department, '08 to 2012. And we reduced the GMIs by 64%.
Yeah.
And we kept it there, and then I retired. And then this is where I learned what you're talking about. The what we missed, institutionalized way as a group. I'm gone. It turned out that we were really successful, but it turned out it was personality driven,
Mhm.
and it was my personality. And then within 5 or 6 years after I left, it faded away. And
Yeah.
the police chief that was there when I was there, he stayed on another 4 or 5 years, and things were still kind of moving along. And then he retired, and there was that transition of command, but there was not the transition of what worked. So
Right.
how do we, what you're talking about, and I want to get into it because you espouse that there are 3 or 4 concrete signs to look for to keep a community safe. That there are what you call those touch points or whatever terminologies used. One, what are those things, and then how can a community institutionalize this practice and not get complacent because they go a few years without a terrible incident?
Yeah. So a few things. The very specific things that you are looking for is often nebulous, and that's one of the biggest sort of hurdles when you're kind of talking to the general public, is that there really is no one or two things that will give you a guarantee that that individual is kind
Mhm.
of like on a pathway of violence. And so the way in which we try to instill that knowledge is to really spread out is spread out the responsibility. So you had mentioned sort of in my introduction, behavioral threat assessment expert, and so I can go through very deep into behavioral threat assessment and check off these boxes and what are the things and things. But when I use the term behavioral threat assessment, it changes the public's sort of context in the environment in which they are operating in. And so they begin to start looking for behaviors that are threatening, right?
Mhm.
And you often, when you get to that point in the stage of the pathway, you're already playing catch up. And so sometimes you have to reframe the structures by which you are sort of operating under. And one of the things that we do effectively is that we keep the core ethos of behavioral threat assessment because we find it to be much more precise than profiling or looking at risk factors and trying to decipher whether or not this person is at risk. And the reason why we do that is because when you profile, your internal biases will get placed upon that person. And then if you look at risk factors are not indicative of future behavior. And also risk factors come with sort of an outside looking in type of dynamic where, because you're not in that environment, you look at the environment and you sort of see, oh, there's a lot of poverty, or there's a lot of gang violence, or there's a lot of domestic abuse. And you say, oh, these are risk factors, they need to be addressed. Where the individual within that environment, their neighbors are experiencing the same thing. Their friends are experiencing the same thing. It's not a risk factor. It's just life.
Mhm.
And so by focusing more on behaviors, you are able to sort of lock into almost an anthropological sort of evolutionary thing that we are kind of hardwired in our brains to look for. Our brains are designed through our sensory systems to identify abnormalities. There's only a limited amount of bandwidth that we are able, from an information standpoint, to gather. And so what we do is we prioritize through our sensories the abnormal stuff. And there's, whether it's taste or it's sight or it's hearing or it's smell, or even that sort of sixth sense that sometimes we get that just something isn't right. And there are people who will say that this might be a reason why water is clear, tasteless, and has no smell. Because from an evolutionary standpoint, if water was the color of Mountain Dew, it would be very difficult for us to decipher if it tasted different, or if there was something sort of in it that looked weird, or if it smelled a certain way. And so by eliminating all of that, we can better decipher, oh, this smells weird, it has like sulfur in it, I don't want to drink it, or this looks gray or murky, I'm not going to drink it because there might be something in it. So that we are already kind of hardwired for that stuff. This also goes to sort of the framing and the pushback that I do of the idea of, like, there's no such thing as a random act of violence. Okay. Because when you use random acts of violence, you pigeonhole the framing into people kind of going in a direction of a more protection or preparedness / response modality, right? If you don't know where the attack is going to come from, or you don't know who's going to do it, yes, by all means, put as many protective layers between me and everything else, because we don't know where it's coming from. And this goes back to sort of that paradoxical narrative of, you have individuals that have shown through years of concerning behavior, of escalatory behavior, but haven't really hit those threshold points, right? And so we do know where these individuals are coming from. We do know who needs help. We do know who are showing signs of escalatory behavior to the point where they're talking about doing violence or prepping for violence and things like that. We just have scattered those reporting mechanisms sort of and given the responsibility to certain programs and agencies and things like that have created those thresholds. And so one of the things that we try to do is we try to really level out the playing field of what is it that we're actually looking for. And we try to get the general public to understand, and they kind of inherently already do, that struggling comes in a lot of different forms. And we don't actually know if that one incident on top of a bunch of others throughout the years is going to sort of be the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? And so we have to take every sort of incident, or we have to create an environment within our schools, our office, spaces, our communities, where if somebody is having sort of a tough time, that we are able to kind of surround that individual and get them over the hump. Now, the level of intervention or interruption that you're going to need to do is going to vary. Sometimes that's as simple as just saying hello in the morning. Sometimes that's as easy as just, having a short 15-minute conversation and just letting somebody know that you're there for them, and if they have any other problems. Some it gets medium, where maybe it's, we've had instances where we've had bus drivers as part of the behavioral threat assessment team, and they have reported that they've seen students come to the bus stop in a car that looked like there was pillows and stacked with blankets and stuff like that in the back. And sure enough, that family had been evicted from their apartment. All right, well, that's not something that is a threatening behavior, right? And so those types of things often go unsaid to a behavioral threat assessment team. So what we try to do is we try to reframe it. We've had a really good success of relabeling them as care teams. And by doing that, it sort of encompasses a lot of different things, because when you're talking about really far upstream prevention, you don't really know if that incident is going to lead somebody to substance abuse or to suicidal ideation or to violence or to a host of other, or all three, right? A bunch of different things. And we've gotten a lot of responses from, when we go out and do our seminars and our trainings and stuff like that. We'll get feedback of, yeah, I had, signs of child trafficking training, and then I had signs of domestic abuse, and then I had signs of sexual abuse training, and then I had signs of substance abuse.
Yeah.
And that all kind of merged into one. There was a sort of this like paralysis in training. And so I heard what you were saying with targeted violence, and it all kind of mixed in. And so I decided to wait until another sort of behavior came forward or another incident came forward, so I knew which specific track to intervene on. And that's one of the things that we try to sort of push against. We're not trying to wait to get sort of a very highly specific lane that those individuals are going down, because they can mix and match different lanes and all kinds of things. And by the time you really do a full intercession, they may already have gone down, or you may not be able to see when the next incident happens. You may be a second grade teacher that sees maybe one incident, and then the next incident that would give you a little bit more fidelity on what pathway they're going might be in 7th grade. So you're not going to be able to see that. So we want to sort of address those issues sort of upfront, have a collaborative kind of concept, and different strategies in place, so that those, if you are evicted from your apartment, you probably also have, food insecurity now. You probably also have a lot of other issues that, there are different social problems and stuff like that. So instead of putting the onus on the person in crisis to navigate through all of their crises, we want to try to be more proactive, get to it, irregardless of the severity of the issue or anything else. But just have that touch point and be proactive, so that these things don't begin to sort of compound and pile up. And then all of a sudden you're sort of off to the races, and your intervention and your intercession techniques have to be far more aggressive with, much more, overt things that can get a lot of people scared in the peripheral.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. You touched on a lot of things. The idea, language is so important. And when we use the word threat, we automatically trigger. If somebody there's an Amber Alert that goes out, or what do you call it? Back in the day when we had tornado sirens in Missouri, they'd go off, and you're not expecting it, and B, it just triggers what we've been taught is, flight, fight, or freeze.
Yep.
And that gets into an emotional reaction as opposed to an intellectual, structured response to chaos or the unexpected or whatever. Yeah. And so I like what you said, that you're calling them care teams. And I'm not big on acronyms because I just can't remember, I can't remember what they all mean. And but one I use, that the word care, I use it when I teach homicide investigations to detectives, that care means you have to commit all resources and energy. That's what it stands for. And as gruesome as a scene may be, and how emotionally, spiritually, physiologically, psychologically it's taxing on you, you still have to commit all resources and energy to solve this crime. And what you're talking about, I think, and changing the language is that a care team. I think people get caught up in this when we start talking about interacting with people who are in crisis or that have intellectual or developmental disabilities. Is we're not asking you to diagnose them. We're asking you to be situationally aware of what's going on and then get them to the right resources.
Mhm.
And that's what I hear you saying, is that for communities, is that we're not out there to do this deep dive diagnosis and put medical terms to this person's psychosis or that, whatever it is. No, be situationally aware, and don't be Kermit the Frog sipping the Lipton tea in the meme, that is
Mhm.
none of my business. It
Yep.
is, and you can be that first person. It's like, compare what you're talking about to the movement within at least the Christian community, is they call it random acts of kindness. Well, you can be, and you're being situationally aware where you see someone in need. You're not randomly doing something, you're intentionally taking a step, paying it forward and all those things. That same analysis, I think, is what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And context sort of matters, and the biggest fundamental sort of gap that I see with sort of the general public is a lack of understanding of what motivates behavior, right? And I think there's a sort of a trickle down um sort of process where we feel something first, that initiates a behavior, and then our thoughts and opinions come from that. And then what we will do is we will post rationalize why we did the behavior that we did, right? We think that our thoughts and opinions about something, we hear something and that triggers a thought, which then triggers a behavior to or different feelings. And I can demonstrate this. Like, if I say, if an event happens, 8% of the population is going to die, that triggers an emotion like, this is a huge event, right?
Mhm.
8% of the population will die, and I am on alert right now, and I am going to do behaviors that are going to try and protect me from that event. If I say 92% of the population will survive this event, I just, water off a duck's back, right? I assume I'm going to be in the 92%, and we're saying the same things, but the context and the feeling that comes with that context motivates my behavior before my thoughts and opinions about it are even formed. And so when we look at trying to intercede, or you sort of your random act of kindness, we don't necessarily know the compounding effect of what that sort of random act of kindness can do, because how somebody feels and how that behavior is, how that behavior flows, um, is is unknown. If you begin to sort of combat an individual, let's say, that is sort of struggling or is pontificating about something that you disagree with, or find abhorrent or something like that, and you try to debate that individual, you are basically trying to go upstream. You are trying to change their thoughts and opinions, which will then change their behavior and their feelings. It only goes one way. It goes downward. It's very difficult to go up. And so, as when you realize how everything is sort of feelings based and how everything is kind of subjective, you begin to realize that individuals who sort of become, and I use this term very, very loosely because I don't really know another terminology that works, is sort of radicalization, where somebody has been radicalized. And how does that person become radicalized? So all of us have these sort of three metaphorical buckets that we are always searching to fill. And those three buckets are identity, purpose, and community. Okay. And so we are either looking for things to fill those buckets, because in the absence of those things, or we are looking for things to reconfirm what those buckets have in them. And the reason why we do this is because the human brain finds it not acceptable to not know who we are. And so, in the absence of not knowing where your community is, or what your purpose is, or what your identity is, you will go out and you will search it. And so oftentimes we will latch on to certain things, not because we necessarily identify with the message, but because we are getting those intangibles that we didn't have before. And so when we look at how those feelings into thoughts and then the motivating factors behind sort of what we are looking for, we can sort of see how we can begin to do these sort of intercessions or these interruptions. If we use the term intervention, we create a top-down power dynamic. So in a classic intervention, you will see somebody with substance abuse who, chemically dependent. That works. That type of top-down, I'm going to come over the top and take control of you so that we can get you clean, works because their emotions and their mindset is that they want to, but they physically can't. Okay. When people have become radicalized, if you want to try and off-ramp them to something more productive or something safer or something like that, you can't do an intervention. Okay, because that top-down dynamic, you're working with somebody that is psychologically and emotionally dependent upon those sort of three buckets, right? Whatever that thing is that's filling those buckets, I'm emotionally and psychologically attached to it. So you come at me with sort of like, well, this study says this, and people are saying that you're, saying this, and this is unacceptable, and we have a code of conduct. It becomes an identity attack, right? It becomes, you don't have a place here. You have no value here. Your purpose is wrong. Your identity is wrong. The people you hang out with wrong. And what we do is we basically double down and we dig in our heels and we become further isolated. And you mentioned sort of what are sort of the big signs that we can sort of look for. That is the huge one. A social isolation is one of the things that is the biggest triggers or precursors to somebody who is obviously struggling, on top of maybe some outbursts and things like that. Somebody who begins to become distant to their family, friends, employers, colleagues, etc., and just sort of begins to migrate into whatever it is that is filling those buckets, and that sort of becomes their raison d'etre. If you can deliver or showcase other options that will provide that identity, that purpose, and that community, people are only as faithful as their options dictate. And so that they will naturally migrate. And why I use more of sort of an intercession or a negotiation type of interruption is because if, you remember from your cop days, if you go to a bank robbery, you don't do an intervention, you do a negotiation. You want that individual to feel as though they have sort of the power and control to sort of come out of the building and leave the hostages as safe. You don't come in and go, okay, Bob, you robbed this bank, we're taking control now, and we're going to bust down the door and we're going to tell you exactly what to do and everything else. You basically try to lure that person away from the behaviors that they are doing and move them into the behaviors that are beneficial for everybody. And I'll show you a couple of different examples of how this works, because when I start using radicalization, people start thinking of, I've attached myself to some sort of terrorist group or something like that, but it really works. So AA uses the same technique, right? I go into an AA meeting, I go, hi, my name's Rob and I'm an alcoholic. Boom, I've already confirmed my identity. My community are the rest of the people in that room that are also identify as alcoholics or as substance abusers. And then our purpose is to keep everybody clean, right? And so now I've got a purpose. I'm there to help others, and they're there to help me. That community is there, and I identify as somebody who has a substance abuse problem. And so that locks in. You saw this also during COVID. A lot of public health experts became very, very agitated during COVID over people's lack of taking their advice or questioning their advice.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because they have the MPH or the MD after their name. And they identify as a public health person. Their purpose is to keep the people healthy, and they believe that. And the community that they are with are other public health entities and people that share that same thing. So you can sort of see how it takes a lot of different forms. It just depends on how deep you have gone sort of into that, and how personally and how singular these types of things that you've latched onto are there. Many times we will have sort of different spouts, for lack of a better analogy, that are filling those buckets, right? So I can identify as a violence prevention expert. I can also identify as a father, as an American, as a Rhode Islander. Like, I've got a bunch of different spouts that are kind of putting in that bucket. And so when you become isolated, you begin to sort of reduce those spouts, and you become very singular. And so you can sort of see how difficult it is psychologically and emotionally to kind of get off that train. And we've seen attackers through their manifestos and their journal entries and things like that express regret and some sort of consciousness that the pathway that they're going down is bad, right? They'll apologize to their family for what they're about to do. They'll apologize to the potential victims that are going to happen in their families. And logically and for reasons we don't understand. All right, well, if you know that it's going that way, why don't you just jump off? And the reason why is because they can't. They truly psychologically and emotionally cannot get off, because there is nothing there to fill that bucket. And as I mentioned, like, the brain will not just jump into the unknown without any options available to it.
Yeah.
And so this becomes sort of a means to an end. This isn't something oftentimes that they are fully committed to, but this is something that they sort of are just being pulled almost in an addiction type direction of, this just has to be done.
Yeah, man. And your three buckets reminds me of Chris Voss.
Yes.
Never Split the Differences. That in negotiations, you're not trying to get the other person to say, yeah, you are right. You're trying to get them to go, yeah, that's right. That the idea or the course of action that you want them to take. And then and we're going to have this next guy, Robin Dreek, is going to be on the show here coming up a little bit, couple weeks down the road. He was an expert. They were both FBI guys. Chris was the number one hostage negotiator for all things American, international hostage negotiation. Robin, counter intelligence guy, and he has a lot of the same things you're talking about, and he kind of, I think it's you're both saying the same thing, but he does it in just a little different perspective of that. What we all crave and want in our lives is safety, security, prosperity, and control. And like you're saying, that top down approach may be, now you're threatening their sense of safety, security, prosperity, and control. And they may have a illogical, or what we can't see as reasonable perception of what is safety, security, prosperity, and control. It's kind of almost perverted um, in an extreme emotional way.
Yeah, because
Eh,
emotions don't follow logic,
right.
right? They don't
Yeah. Yeah.
follow reason, and there's a lot of stumbling points when you try to sort of look at human beings in the way in which we want to sort of conduct their behavior in a very linear fashion of sort of, if we do this, if X plus Y equals X. And then sort of I talk about this idea of, 3 times 1 doesn't equal 1 times 3. And the reason why is because of the different contexts in which we find ourselves. Um, if you go into a bar and you see 3 people in that bar with 1 drink, you have one contextual sort of narrative that's there. If you go into a bar and you see 1 person with 3 drinks next to them, you have a completely different
Yeah.
contextual thing there. And this goes back to sort of the no random violence and how we move to a more protection and response. One of the other things that we're really, really terrible at is assessing value. And it's one of the things that we all intrinsically want to have in our lives. We want to be known as having value, whether it is
Mhm.
through our communities or through what we do or our talents and things like that. That there's a value attached to them, but that value is highly subjective, right? And it's the reason why The Price is Right has been on the air for so long, is because we have no reference to decipher what a week-long all expense paid trip to Cancun is worth as compared to, a 14 cubic foot refrigerator. Like that we cannot tell the difference. And there's been a lot of studies within sort of behavioral economics that have come out to sort of confirm this, where they've one economist sort of came out with a study that basically concluded human beings cannot decipher between the person that cooks the quality of the person that cooks the food and the quality of the person that sweeps the floor, right? It's all encompassing. So if you go into a restaurant and it's serving Michelin star food, but it's next to a fertilizer plant and everything smells like fertilizer, you are
Yeah.
not going to be able to decipher that the food on your plate is so much better than a McDonald's, right?
Yeah.
And so when we start talking about sort of security, that value perspective and context is really, really important, because we don't necessarily have a really good metric on how to measure the success of, let's say, cameras or bulletproof glass or fences and barbed wire and X amount of police or security personnel within a certain range. And
Mm.
right. So what we do is we go, all right, well, if I'm paying $250,000 for all of this stuff, I'm going to assume the theoretical value of what I'm getting back in return is that plus some. Um, and so when I begin to talk about, prevention and the importance of prevention, I try to let them know, like, I'm not trying to supplant the protection and the response stuff. There's value to that, and there is a place for it. But much like Michelin, who is going to sort of rate you on ambiance, service, and
Mm.
then food, right? We need to have a security sort of system that is based on prevention, protection, and response, and that they're all sort of at an even level, to make the whole experience like cohesive and how we want it. And so, I share this story sometimes of me going into a liquor store, and as I approach the liquor store, I see the cameras and I see the bulletproof, and the bars on the windows and a reinforced door and I open the door and there's harsh fluorescent lighting, and I go into this holding pen where I then have to go through a metal detector, and I'm getting wanded by a security security guard who has a gun on him. And then I finally get into the actual store, and I can see the CCTV cameras and me on it, and floor to ceiling bulletproof glass. And then I have to do all my commerce through a drawer. And I remember thinking in that moment, like, I'm in the safest place probably I've ever been in my life, and yet I'm the scaredest I've ever been and more
Yeah.
terrified than
Yeah.
I've ever been in my life, because the narrative isn't, oh, look at all these wonderful security measures, don't you feel safe? It's what the heck goes on here that they felt the need to put all these things here. And if they felt a need to put all this stuff here, this must be a pretty rough and bad place, and I don't want to be in here. And so when we talk about sort of that holistic security, we really have to concentrate on trying to keep those levels kind of balanced, and not to get too meta or zen. But one of the things that I tell my audiences is that what we are looking for is to try and make the water as still as possible so that we can tell what's causing the ripple. And the more of the protection and response capabilities and measures that we put in, the more ripples get into that sort of water. And what it does is it forces us, as I mentioned earlier, the abnormalities of what we're looking for. It shrinks that viewpoint where it becomes, we are going to prioritize the things that are sort of right in front of our face.
Mm-hmm.
And by doing that, we might miss the more subtle ripples that are happening along the sides, that are things that we can really pick off easily and subdue. And we have a better sense of where the actual threat is and where the imminent threat is. And I think one of the things that we have sort of done is we've just sort of imbalanced that, where because we don't really have a good metric on the value of these things, we either use a monetary quantitative value, or we just say, well, things aren't happening, therefore
It's
where it's working. And
Yeah.
that's not really a metric that you can use. And everybody that I've kind of talked to and presented to and everything else, they all love this more proactive prevention sort of mentality or philosophy around it. And people feel better, more empowered, and feel that people are sort of looking out for them, and they're more comfortable. And there really isn't, I mean, how much is that worth to you, right? If you are a school and kids generally enjoy going to school and are happy, and the parents are satisfied and they're happy, like, what kind of number do you put on that they enjoy being in the space, that they want to be in the space, that they take pride in that, and they begin to get that sort of identity, purpose, and community from that space? How much is that sort of worth? And so a lot of this stuff is this sort of a quantitative and qualitative balancing act that we kind of have to do. But there definitely is an imbalance currently, that we have sort of created through maybe our framing and the words that we use, and how we've structured these different types of institutions and systems to look more at a sort of defensive, reactive sort of methodology, rather than a proactive and on the front foot sort of preventative methodology.
Wow. One of the things that spurred a thought is, and we had him on the show at the a year ago, and he's a friend of mine. He's a retired lieutenant colonel, Special Forces Delta guy. He has a Green Beret. He has a Ranger tab, 82nd Airborne. He's done it all, and his last part of his career was he ran literally what they call a unit of Special Force Delta operators. And here's how he described what you were just talking about. He goes, "You're looking for an Easter egg, and when you're doing an Easter egg hunt, even your kids, they know this, is they're looking for what's out of place." And I think that's the analogy that we could take what you're saying in a very common way is when you are out and about, it's not that you have to be paranoid, but you have to be situationally aware and what behaviors are out of place. Like the guy with a long trench coat and a winter hat on and it's 95 degrees outside kind of deal. You're looking for behaviors that are abnormal.
Hmm.
Just like you're on an Easter egg hunt, you're looking for what is out of place in this picture. The egg, that's when you see the egg. And I thought it's a really fundamental human skill set that we have. We just don't hone it and exercise it.
Yeah, and I think this goes to a responsibility shift or delegation that we do with sort of like those institutions that we kind of task for these different things, whether it's law enforcement or our mental health clinical people, that we have them there, so therefore it's their problem, right? They're there
Right.
to look out for them. And I think there's a strange, again, going back to sort of the narratives. I work with a lot of schools and we talk to the SROs or the school resource
Mhm.
officers and things like that at the school. And it's really funny to get them sort of alone and ask them what their role and responsibilities are, and then ask the student population or the staff what their narrative of the
Yeah.
SRO is. And part of security, there's a huge customer service element to
Mhm.
it that often goes misplaced. And with the SRO sort of example, they look at themselves as sort of extensions almost of the guidance counselors or the school counselors, with a extra layer of sort of law enforcement security professionalization added on top of it. But they're wandering the halls hoping that they're gathering some information. They want to be
Right.
friends of the students. They feel very, very passionate that these are sort of like their kids, right? That narrative isn't what the kids have and isn't what the staff has. They look at them as like, when S hits the fan,
Yeah.
right? You are my first line of defense. So what the SROs end up missing are those seemingly innocuous events in that individual's life. Like, I'm not going to go to an SRO and chat them up about a breakup with my boyfriend or a girlfriend,
Mhm.
right? Like, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to chat them up about being cut from the soccer team. I'm not going to talk to them about issues that my parents are having financially, right? Because I don't view you as really like an extension of a guidance counselor or a mental health expert. I look at you as basically a cop, right? And so the only reason I would go to you for to tell you any kind of information is if you are, behavioral threat assessment, right? Like, you're doing something that I feel warrants the responsibility of taking care of this from
Right.
a sort of a law enforcement perspective. Um, and there may not necessarily be something of that the law enforcement can necessarily do. They're not doing anything illegal or whatever. So you've got these very competing different narratives. And one of the things that is interesting with human behavior is something called the doorman fallacy. So when you go to a hotel or you go to um, an apartment building or any kind of building, and you see a doorman there have been studies that we sort of like sit up straighter, we
Mhm.
conduct ourselves a little bit more professional. There's just an element of narrative that, like, this is a really nice, important place. We need to sort of fit in, right? And you see the same thing with valet service. Those are looked at as customer service sort of entities,
Mhm.
not as security entities. And so one of the things that is an issue that I sort of see is this doorman fallacy, that we sort of reduce the role of the doorman as just opening doors and bringing in bags, right? And that if we just put sort of a special lock on the door or a special type of automatic door and put some cameras in there, that we can sort of reduce that salary and will be equally as safe and as equally as classy. And that doesn't happen. That's not what occurs,
Right.
because the doorman is a lot more. He's scanning, he's personable, he just projects that sense of sort of like, oh, this is a nice place, I'm going to do it. But what he's also doing is he's taking that human intel of, he can look down the block and see that somebody is kind of
Yeah.
lurking there. And, 3 hours before or last Wednesday, they were there too, and they were looking really, really strange. And maybe that's something that I need to be more aware of. They know, where the road closures are, and they're talking to other people, and they're getting information from other hotels and all this types of stuff. But they also just present themselves in this way that immediately people that are coming you're going to see a behavior change. And
Yeah.
so those abnormalities are going to be triggered really way quicker and much more effective than, say, a cameraman, or even somebody in sort of law enforcement garb or security guard garb, right? Because
Right.
you're going to be more guarded seeing that than you will, a guy with a top hat and a trench coat, right?
Yeah.
And those types of framing and contextual stuff that aren't necessarily considered within the security space, we try to instill at least that contextual knowledge, so that when they begin to sort of take the next step of formulating plans or reaching out to coordinate things, that they keep that sort of human contextual element in their minds when they're developing these things.
Yeah. I think the big elephant in the room, and I'm reading Robin's book right now, The Code of Trust. That's the big elephant in the room when it comes to all these discussions about threat assessment, and then after an incident, assessing blame to somebody that failed or screwed up or could have, should have, would have done, is uh, we leave out the trust building component, and that's why we get siloed. That's why, oh, if you see something, say something. Well, I start saying something to law enforcement, and they go, hey, you're just being paranoid.
Right.
Okay, well, now I don't trust you because you don't trust me, and now I'm going to keep my mouth shut, and then it'll be your fault if something bad happens.
Yeah.
And we leave out that component of involving everyone. It's not just law enforcement's threats, are not just law enforcement's problem. It's not just the community's problem. It's not just mental health or the school teachers. It is everybody's problem, and we need to start intentionally building relationships with one another when we do have to keep something compartmentalized because of national security, or some really legitimate reasons. That's one thing. But how do you recommend, in your experiences and case studies and everything, how do we build that relationship between all these competing, they're not competing, they're complementary um, entities who don't realize that they're complementary. So how do we build trust?
Exactly. Well, that's the biggest thing that becomes the big revelation for a lot of these, cities and towns and states, is that there are two sort of levels of gaps. There's a gap where there's a resource gap, where you have an issue and there really isn't anything there to take care of that issue, and therefore you need to create it. Much more likely, though, the gap is a coordination gap, where you just don't you're not in that world, or this is the first time you have a touch point to an incident or an issue like this. And there actually are hundreds, if not thousands, of different resources available to you, but you just haven't plugged into them in a correct manner. And I think one of the ways in which, your example of sort of the see something, say something campaign, we've now have basically a generation of people who know nothing but that. And from a marketing standpoint, that is a really excellent and fantastic thing, because it doesn't really say what we're supposed to be looking for, but we all kind of know. And it doesn't say what we have to say or who we have to say it to, but we also kind of know. And to a certain point, if you see something and you go and you tell a police officer, or you go and tell, a person that's working at an establishment or something like that, like, hey, I noticed this, they are going to kind of ask, all right, well, is this within my lane of responsibility?
Yeah.
Right. And okay, you see a person who's ranting and raving, obviously probably, on something, or is just severely agitated. That's not my responsibility as for
Right.
what my role is, but that's kind of like somebody there, like, oh, but there's no officer here. All right, well, what do you want me to do? Right. And the same sort of thing, you see this with all the different entities where, you might call a mental health helpline or something like that, and they'll ask you, well, are they a threat to themselves or others? And you go, well, no, I don't think so. And they're like, well, they got to get to the back of the line, because I got a stack of people who are, and I've got a limited amount of clinicians. Or you'll go to law enforcement and they'll ask you, like, all right, well, are they doing anything illegal? And like, no. All right, well, what are not much I can do. Right. And so part of how we begin to really break down those silos is making each one of these kind of entities a component, but not the nucleus of the reporting. A lot of behavioral threat assessment teams right now are located in sort of educational institutions, whether it be, a school, a high school,
All right.
or a school district
University.
or something
Yeah.
like that. And we really sort of we don't necessarily like to push that philosophy, because it puts an unnecessary burden on the school to be the coordinating agency, and the nucleus of that team, to reach out to all these different nodes, whether it be mental health, law enforcement, Department of Rec, sanitation department, houses of worship, the list goes on and on and on and
Right.
on.
Yeah.
And so what we try to do is we try to elevate that to sort of a town or community level, where the school, law enforcement, mental health, sanitation department, Department of Rec, libraries, whatever it is, boys and girls clubs, they're all sort of have seats at the table, but they're not the coordinating entity. And by doing that, you have a much more fluid information gathering sort of system, where people might be acting very, very strange at school, but they're fantastic at when they go to their weekend soccer games with the Department of Rec, right? Or they may have had they may have some mental health problems, but they are also a former veteran. And if we can get the veterans group that's here to talk to them, maybe we'll get some better fidelity on what might be their issue, or something like that. Same thing with houses of worship. You want to spread that responsibility as far as it can, because you're not looking, as you said, you're not looking for people to be intervention specialists and tackle it. What you're trying to get is like a complete picture of what's going on in that person's life. And by that, you can sort of see, oh yeah, they had a breakup, a family member died, they decided to they got injured from the soccer team or something like that. And there's this character arc of like, well, 4 or 5 people knew about little slivers of this, and now we were able to put this puzzle together, and yeah, this person definitely is experiencing some hardships, and maybe the classic route that we take of interrupting that individual's steps, we take a completely different intervention approach with somebody that might have a little bit more sort of trust or a little bit more relatability to that individual than the classic cop or the mental health. I also think that there's a sense that, you know, what we've done, you talked about it, like the competing resources. 988 is a fantastic program that's been rolled out sort of for mental health. However, there have been a lot of progressive states or communities and things like that that have implemented sort of ride-along programs with their police force, where there's an actual, you know, clinician that on calls that are deemed sort of mental health calls, they go out and they're able to intervene. There are CIT teams, which are sort of like crisis intervention teams, which also handle mental health calls and things like that. So now you've got sort of 3 layers of resources all competing for sort of money,
the same
and
dollars.
and they're all trying to compete for the same patients, right? And they don't necessarily know who's the tip of the spear, what agency or what initiative is sort of the tip of the spear, and what is the safety net in case somebody slips through. And so these resources are only getting to maybe like 15 or 20% their actual capabilities, because you've got 3, 4, sometimes 6 layers of different of resources that are all sort of trying to compete for that same individual to just go to their program or be associated with their initiative. And so really, you know, it's almost like going, you know, in November or something like that, you start taking out the Christmas lights, and then you realize like they're all intertangled and everything else. Like, one of the things that we sort of do on a long-term basis for the people that sort of hire us and want our consulting and stuff like that is really to try and unwind and untangle that sort of web of Christmas lights, of really trying to figure out where the commonalities of those resources are. And then, all right, how do we either mesh those, or how do we amplify one, or let's give one a different role and purpose, so that there's a flow to the whole thing, where everybody, when it gets to the attention of this program, we know what type of level we're talking about and where our responsibility is, maybe be just for situational awareness. And then if it goes to another level, we know, all right, these are the things that we have to begin to react to put us in a place where, you know, we can stop this. And so that the probability of them passing through that second layer is a little bit less. And it just gets less and less and less, because the last thing that you sort of want is to hit that threshold of somebody posts something or somebody hears something that there's going to be an imminent attack, and you get everybody ramped up, right? You get all of your response, all of your preparedness stuff, and you basically create this sort of ripple effect across the entire environment, where people who aren't even involved or are on the periphery now all of a sudden are scared, right? You had to activate your behavioral threat assessment team, and you know, cops were called to the school and everything else. And then the whole community now is completely shook, right?
In panic mode.
They're panicked and they're waiting for the next. And now then you all of a sudden get into that framework of like, well, we need to have more hard security, or we need more cops around, and we need more all this and more. And I think what happens is, because we have this sort of rack and stack and this very convoluted coordination sort of issues, that you're able to sort of see people fall through the cracks. And even though the probability is low that these attacks happen, the cost of them is extreme, right? Low probability, high consequence. And if you are trying to thread the needle, that you are going to be able to respond in like the quickest, most effective manner possible, I used the example of Connor Betts. Now, being from Ohio, you probably know this case where this individual, late on a Sunday night, so really late Saturday, went down a popular street with a lot of restaurants and bars and things like that. It was, I believe it was 32 seconds from the first shot till the moment he was put down. He killed 9 people, injured 27 others. Now, the weird thing about that is that there were about 6 to 8 cops that were already lined that street when the attack began. And so I use that as sort of an example of, 32 seconds between the first shot and that individual being sort of taken down. That is really good. Like you would be really hard pressed to find a better response. And then you start going through, all right, but there were 6 people already there. But then you start looking at Connor's history and you start seeing stuff going back to like kindergarten, right? Behavioral problems for kindergarten and multiple issues and suspensions from school, and a lot of concerning behavior with what he was posting on social media and different hits and interactions with police at his house for different domestic, right? And so you begin to sort of see like we focused our attention on trying to thread that needle, that we were going to respond as quickly as we could. And we did. We responded in probably the fastest way we probably could, in 32 seconds. And still 9 people died, 27 people, got injured, and hundreds of people are never the same, right, for the rest of their life because of PTSD and everything else. And that whole area is now defined by this 32-second incident that sort of happened. And so if we, going back to sort of like balancing out of the sort of this idea of holistic security, where, we need to have a prevention methodology and mission that needs to be amplified, because Connor Betts should never have gotten to the point where he was even considering doing that, because there were so many different events that were giving us the signals that like this person needs real assistance and real help and needs to be off-ramped in a really big way. And yet, because different institutions or different programs had only certain incidences that they were working off, they couldn't see sort of the whole picture and whole character arc that was going. And so they were waiting for him to kind of trip over their tripwire or their threshold for them to respond. And unfortunately, he went, way past that. And so those are the types of things that we try to sort of instill into, our clients and to the general public, to really examine and sort of look at how things are just framed, how systems are developed, and who's responsible for what.
Yep. And my daughter missed that event by 30 minutes. She left. She was a general manager, part owner of one of the pubs down there. It's in the Oregon district in Dayton, Ohio. And she'd left 30 minutes before he started shooting. So, and then you take that, and we're going to kind of wrap it up here, because this was that whole community. I had already retired and was living in Ohio, but I had been the commander of the downtown district at one time. But in a period of about a year and a half, you had that incident. You had a Dayton officer that was a DEA task force officer that my daughter also knew, was shot and killed, executing a warrant. And then you had a horrific a tornado that wiped out just tons of areas of parts of Dayton. All 3 of those things in a year and a half on one community is like incredibly difficult.
Yeah, that's a lot. That is definitely a lot.
Yeah. So, man, I want to thank you. You had a lot of insights here. People can reach you at T as in Tom, V as in Victor, T as in Tom, P as in Patrick, solutions.com. So
Correct. So TVTP, I know you hate acronyms, but it stands for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. So TVTP solutions.com. There's a contact page, and we do bespoke services. So whether or not you are just general public or your mental health or education or law enforcement or anything like that, we can tailor our trainings and seminars, related to that. We get the most bang for the buck. But please, by all means, send me an email and we'll work on what's best fit for you, whether that is consulting on plans that you already have, developing them, or just generalized training.
awesome.
We can do any and all of the above.
Awesome. And for our listeners, I'll put the website in the notes, show notes. So, Rob, thanks for being here. Looking forward to getting you back on and getting a little deeper into maybe some specific uh, cases of where we could have done better or lessons learned from those incidents. And for our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Your loyalty now has us in over 30 countries on six continents. Be sure to connect with us, the Warrior Servant Leader podcast.com, LinkedIn, join our community of Warrior Servant Leaders, our newsletter there, which is free. Pat Welsh JD it's all under that name. And we're on YouTube, Instagram, your favorite platforms. And if you want to learn more about the Warrior Servant Leader mindset, feel free to grab one of my books on Amazon, Warrior Servant Leader, Life Behind the Badge, or Warrior Servant Leader, Life Behind the Cross. And I end every episode with this. Again, to our listeners, thank you. And always, always, always strive to do the right thing at the right time, the right way, and for the right reasons, because that's what warrior servants, leaders do every day, every time. Love you all. See you next week.